Okay, today I am reviewing Agatha Christie's Elephants Can Remember. Elephants Can Remember is a 1972 novel by Ms. Christie and features Hercule Poirot. Probably I think it's the last novel that she wrote using Poirot. However, there was a novel published posthumously featuring Poirot and some short stories. This one also is the last Ariadne Oliver mystery, and what makes this rather plodding, long, short novel interesting is its preoccupation with memory and the reliability of memory. A lot of Christie's later novels deal with this one. What makes this one more interesting is the fact that recent studies have talked about how in this novel there was a significant drop in the number of words that Christie used. So her lexile level went way down, leading many to believe that during this novel she started really developing Alzheimer's. And it makes it very interesting because this story is all about trying to remember. A woman named Mrs. Burton Cox comes up to Ariadne Oliver when she is at a literary luncheon, and she tells Ariadne that her son wants to marry this young woman whose surname is Ravenscroft, and but she's a little worried because the Ravenscroft had a little notorious past, and she goes to Ariadne because Ariadne is this girl's godmother. Ariadne was at school with Mrs. Ravenscroft, and now the air conditioning is probably just killing this. Okay, I'm back. Just came inside because it was too noisy outside. So what was I saying? Mrs. Oliver, her goddaughter is of a marriageable age, and she has found a young man that she likes, and he likes her. The mother is a little worried and doesn't want her son, or wants to find out a bit more about this young lady before she permits her son to become engaged to this woman. And the reason that we're led to believe she's concerned is because a few years before, when this girl was a teenager, her parents were both found on a cliffside, dead, with a gun between them, and both of their fingerprints were on the gun. So people thought, well, it's either a double suicide, some kind of suicide pact, or one of the husband shot the wife and then shot himself, or vice versa, the wife shot the husband and shot herself. And the details of this kind of messy parental death were never cleared up. So she asks, rather rudely, Miss Oliver to look into this. Ariadne goes to Poirot. He says, leave it alone, it's in the past. But she decides that it's kind of too nagging and that she's going to do it. And so Poirot agrees to help her. And so they start talking about, they start interviewing a series of older people who they call elephants because of the old adage that an elephant never forgets. So in this one, elephants can remember. The little variation on the saying has to do with the fact that there is memory, but memory is not always reliable. And as Poirot always says, is that you can get people talking and they'll say things that you might not get the full thing, the full accurate memory, but there are always pieces of memories that come out. What comes out is that Mrs. Ravenscroft had a twin sister who had a rather checkered past. In India, a child died, I think her own child, it was a friend's child, after her husband's death. And there was another incident in England that was related to her, and she was a bit psycho, they thought. Also, Mrs. Ravenscroft owned several wigs back in the late 60s when it was popular to wear wigs. Most women owned about 2 wigs, and she owned 4, which Poirot thought was very interesting. The other thing that's interesting is that that Mrs. Ravenscroft's dog bit her, and it was known to be a very loving dog. And this happened right before her death. Interestingly enough, before the couple's murder, suicide, whatever, the sister also died. She was sleepwalking and fell off of a cliff. So, a lot of death in this young girl's past. There's a subplot having to do with Mrs. Burton Cox and her son, which explains a bit more of her interest in this whole affair. It's, again, like late Christie novels, it's talky and it gets a bit bogged down. This was my first time reading it, and I didn't mind it so much. I think that it wasn't as hard to get through as something like Passenger to Frankfurt, which felt eternal. So it wasn't really that bad. Again, and then knowing the motifs of memory and knowing what Christie might have been going through at this time made it really much more interesting for me. Also, this edition of the book, I don't know if all editions of the book do this, but it contained footnotes where anytime a former mystery of Poirot's was mentioned, they leave a little footnote and say what book it comes from, which I thought was kind of interesting. You don't see that very often. So that was interesting. So there's all of this stuff about memory. I mean, Christie's even looking back on her stuff, on her own writing. In Nemesis, Christie was doing the same thing with Miss Marple, and she's doing it here with Poirot and Oliver. In the next novel, Postern of Fate, she'll be doing it with Tommy and Tuppence, with far less success because of her failing mental powers at this point, her decline. It's an interesting idea, but it's not going to go anywhere. So we'll talk about that in the next book. This one has a few plot holes to it, but not a bad read. I would give it of Christie, to give it probably like a 2.75 to 3.